So hello everybody. Today we are going to be talking about systems and environmental systems in particular and thinking about what it means to be a system. And I want to start though with the idea of what is the environment. And one of my favorite definitions was that of an old professor of mine when I was getting my PhD, Herb Wagner, may he rest in peace. The environment is everything but me. And if you think about it, your environment is in fact everything but you. A more technical definition would say something like, oh, the environment comprises the physical, physics, the chemical, which you learned in chemistry, and biological conditions that interact with the growth, development, and life of an organism. So that's a more technical definition of it. What we realize is the environment, if we think about it at all, is actually a system that is composed of many subsystems. And if the environment is mostly stable, then that implies that the systems are balancing conditions. So we want to think about what a system is and what that means. So why don't you take a second and maybe pause the video and think about what it means for something to be a system. Okay, so hopefully you're back now. Here's a definition from Wikipedia. A system is a group of interacting or interrelated entities that form a unified whole. A system is delineated by its boundaries, surrounded and influenced by its environment, described by its structure and purpose, or in the case of natural systems, we would say its effect, since we don't believe that there's anybody who designed these systems for a purpose, but they have effects. They cause things to happen, and is expressed in its functioning. Now, that's a whole lot to think about, and I think you should be thinking about that a lot over the coming weeks. And we're going to take that apart. But the thing I want you to get right now is that the parts of a system are interconnected and interdependent. In other words, they're connected to each other, but they also depend on each other, right? They affect each other through, for example, feedback loops, which we're going to learn about in more detail in class. Systems are also dynamic, and that means that they change over time. And since they change over time, they behave in certain ways. What's amazing about this behavior is that the behavior of a system is often different than the behavior of the individual parts. And when the behavior is different than the individual parts, we call that an emergent property. The emergent properties are something we want to look for. And what's really fascinating about emergent properties is many times they are completely unpredictable. So let's look at each of these things and see what they mean in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, I want to get on to this idea of the Earth as a system of systems, which was our first idea. So I want to go back to that one. Here is someone's diagram of what the Earth systems look like. We have the atmosphere, and that includes the gases of the Earth. And here they are, right? This is somebody's concept map of the systems. And the hydrosphere, which includes the liquid and the solid water. And I would say also the gaseous water, which has been forgotten about here. And it's sometimes also called the cryosphere. That's a word I've never heard. You can forget that one. Well, it's a cool word. Memorize it, but it's not going to be in this course. And then over here we have the geosphere, which includes soil, rocks, and magma, three different forms of solid material. And then finally the biosphere, which includes all living things on Earth. So here's somebody's idea of the Earth as a system of systems with four major systems in it. If we look at these three big abiotic systems, meaning that they largely are run without life, although each one of them is affected by life. And then within these three, we often think that the biosphere, the life itself, uses and modifies the other three. That's an amazing thing to come to appreciate. That I know my view early on was that all the systems of the Earth were just there. They were just right. It was like the Goldilocks idea. They were just right for life on Earth. But in fact, what has happened is life on Earth evolved and then has continually modified the environment. And as the environment is modified, new life forms evolve. And then in addition, there have been outside perturbations, and that's a word you should know, a perturbation, which is a disturbance to a system. There have been outside perturbations that change the system and cause life to have to evolve to it. And the relationship is often depicted in diagrams like this. And here you see somebody's drawn on the outside the atmosphere, the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and in the middle of them, the biosphere. So some sort of drawing that shows that. And the whole thing is powered by energy, especially the biosphere is powered by energy from the sun. So that's a diagram you might see, and I want you to be able to interpret that. At any point in this video, if you need to stop and think about something, pause the video and look at the diagrams and just think about it yourself and jot down questions that you can bring to class, because that will be really key. Hey, I didn't understand in the video when this happened, right? That's a fantastic thing to have talked about. The next thing we want to talk about is I want to look at a diagram of a system, and I want to say, here's a system you probably have never thought about. I know I never have, the geosphere. I have never taken a course in geology, and yet when I looked at this diagram, I immediately understood it. And so I want to just talk to you a little bit about what this diagram means. First of all, the arrows are processes here. So look, here's the process of melting. Here's the process of crystallization. In other words, melting earth becomes magma, and crystallized earth becomes rock. Here's another process, sedimentation and burial. Here's another one, heating and squashing, a very technical drawing this is. And here's another process, uplift to the surface. And here's another process, extrusive igneous rock, which means volcanoes, rock deposited volcanoes. Here's another process, weathering. And here's another process, transport. So now once you know that the arrows represent processes, now all of a sudden this diagram becomes a lot easier. What are the other things going on? Well, these boldface entities here, which are often put in boxes in a diagram, are forms of rock, let's say, of earth, for lack of a better word. And I don't know if you've ever heard that there are 3 kinds of rock. I've heard that all my life, and I never knew really what they are, but now I can see from this diagram, I can learn what they are. First of all, rock that's formed by sediment is sedimentary rock. Well, that's pretty straightforward, a definition. Second, sedimentary rock that then gets heated and squashed and changes forms is metamorphic. And what is metamorphosis but a change in form? And finally, rock that forms from solidified or crystallized magma is called igneous rock. And there are 2 ways for igneous rock to get up to the surface. One is through volcanoes, and the other is for uplift to occur, which is a process that brings all rocks to the surface, of all kinds. And so if you've ever been driving down the road and seen the side of a mountain and seen that it looks layered, well, indeed it is layered, because there are these different processes that occur at different times in the history of the earth and lay down different kinds of rock. And that's why you see the different layers. So again, this diagram, which you came into probably going, holy crow, I don't understand a thing about this. You now probably have an excellent idea as to the rock cycle, which is what this is called. And I could probably start to ask you questions about it, such as, what is the type of rock called that is formed from the solidification of magma? What is the type of rock that is caused by the burial of sediments? What is the type of rock that is caused when sedimentary rock is exposed to extreme heat and extreme pressure? You also know a bunch of other terms. You know the term weathering now, which is the effect of weather on rock, which is to break them into smaller pieces, eventually small fine particles, which are transported to the sea where sediments are formed. So there's so much you can learn from this diagram just by not freaking out and looking at it. How is this a system? Well, this is a system because it has many different parts, they're interconnected, and they depend on one another. The different kinds of rock can become one another. If sedimentary rock melts, it becomes magma, and then magma, when it solidifies, becomes igneous rock. Igneous rock, when it weathers, becomes sedimentary rock. There are processes that interconnect the parts. Third, the system changes over time. It may be another incredible revelation to some of you that the Earth's surface hasn't looked the same. And I remember when I first learned that the continents hadn't always been where they were. I had actually, as a young child, said, doesn't it make sense that South America and Africa fit into each other? Weren't they once connected? And my teachers laughed at me. No, the continents have always been as they are. Well, it turns out as a 5th grader, I was right. They were wrong. And finally, this system has characteristic and predictable behavior. So predictable behavior is producing each type of rock over time. So that's kind of an amazing thing that we can make predictions about this system. Finally, we want to get on to the behavior of systems. Systems behave because their components interact and depend on one another. If a system doesn't vary too much, then it is said to be a stable system, and it maintains conditions stably in the same relative amount, and we call that homeostasis. For example, the Earth climate system is stable because it maintains temperatures on Earth that don't go too far below freezing and don't go too much above mammalian body temperature. Thus, temperature is homeostatically maintained on Earth. Now, homeostasis is often maintained by a set of responses known as feedback. Generally speaking, we have two types of feedback. Feedback refers to the idea that one component of a system affects the behavior of another component of the system. As I said, there are two types. In negative feedback, a change in the system triggers a response that counteracts the change that took place in the first place. So negative feedback tends to move a system to an equilibrium state. Negative feedback is thus often called a balancing or a homeostatic process. And here's an example of a negative feedback loop. A population will increase from a point at which it was balanced, where there was a balance between population and food supply. The food supply becomes inadequate, so as a result, mortality, death increases. This causes the population decrease, and as a result, the population drops back to the balance point where population and food supply are in balance, and so population is back at its original level. There is also positive feedback, and can you guess what positive feedback might be? If negative feedback is a change in the system that triggers a response that counteracts the original change, then positive feedback would be the opposite of that. Why don't you take a second, you can pause this video, and see if you can figure out what the definition of positive feedback. No fair looking it up on Google. Okay, so hopefully you're back now, and let's talk about positive feedback. Well, you got it. In positive feedback, a change in one part of the system triggers a response that intensifies that change that took place. So a change occurs and the system responds by intensifying that change. That's positive feedback. It moves away from an equilibrium state. It's sometimes called a reinforcing process or a disrupting process. Here's an example of a positive feedback loop. Increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to warming of the atmosphere, which leads to melting of the ice at the poles. And since ice is reflected, the surfaces get browner at the poles, which means more heat is absorbed. And that leads to more warming, which leads to more melting, which leads to more brown earth being exposed and more absorption of sunlight. That's an example of positive feedback. Okay, so let's test yourself, because this is a very difficult concept because most people get hung up on the words negative feedback and positive feedback. They assume that negative feedback has a negative consequence and positive feedback has a positive consequence. But that's just simply not the way the words are used here. Let's take the example of a thermostat in your house attached to both the heating and the cooling systems. Is this an example of a negative feedback loop or a positive feedback loop? Why don't you pause the video for a second, figure it out, and then re-click the video, and you can shout at the screen your answer and I'll hear it. You've probably figured out that this is a negative feedback loop because the thermostat, when the house gets too hot, thermostat turns on the air conditioner, temperature comes back to a set point, and the next thing you know, the house is back at whatever your thermostat is set for. Similarly, if the house gets too cool, the heating system goes on, the heating system raises the temperature. That is an example of negative feedback because the original change in conditions triggered a systematic response that brings you back to a pre-existing condition. What about the pancreas? The pancreas in the human body produces insulin, which removes glucose from the blood when there is high blood sugar. So the pancreas senses high blood sugar, puts out insulin, and glucose is removed from the blood. And then when there is low blood sugar, puts out a hormone called glucagon, and glucagon causes the addition of sugar to the blood. Once again, positive feedback or negative feedback. You can pause the video, figure it out. Okay, so as you probably figured out, that's also a negative feedback loop because there's a set point, the normal range of sugar in the blood, and if it gets too low, The system does one thing. If it gets too high, the system does another, both of which are to bring the blood sugar back to an acceptable level, much like the temperature on your thermostat. Here's another one. How about a microphone next to a speaker? You speak into the microphone. It comes out of the speaker, which that is now the input. What is that? You can pause the video if you need to. But most of you have probably figured out, oh my God, that is such a positive feedback loop, because the noise coming out of the speaker now is an amplified input to the microphone, which creates an even more, and you get that ear-piercing screech, positive feedback. What about when the body gets too hot and blood vessels near the surface of your body dilate, you become pink in color, and you lose heat out of the surface of your body? Right, you figured out that's negative feedback, right? Because your temperature got too high, and now the system responds by cooling you off. And finally, what about during childbirth, when the baby pushes against the cervix, which stimulates the brain to produce a hormone called oxytocin, which stimulates more contractions, which causes more pushing on the cervix, which causes more oxytocin, etc., etc. Have you figured that one out? That is positive feedback. And if you are in the one who is in labor, you will indeed find it is a very positive experience to get that baby out of you once contractions have started. So that's negative and positive feedback. The next thing on our list about properties of systems, we were talking about emergent properties. The idea of emergent properties is expressed in the common aphorism, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Because the technical definition of emergent properties is it's when a number of simple entities or agents that operate in a systematic way in an environment form a more complex behavior as a collective than they can individually. That is what an emergent property is. The entity has properties that its components do not have on their own. The property only emerges when the components interact, when they're organized in a way to create this new behavior. Now, what's really amazing about emergent properties is that in many cases, they cannot be predicted, even with complete knowledge of each of the components. So if you have each of the components and you know everything you can know about them when they act alone, you sometimes cannot predict what the emergent property will be. And that's a very interesting case because it hints at the limits of reductionist thought. The idea that you can break everything into components and then understand the whole from the components. Reductionist thought is important, but it's not everything in life. So here are some examples of emergent properties. The chemical behavior of molecules is different and often unpredictable when only considering the behaviors of the atoms that comprise the molecule. In chemistry, just by studying the atoms, we cannot predict how molecules will often function. In some cases we can, but in many cases we cannot. The ability of a car to move. On their own, none of the parts can do this, but put them together in just the right way and the car can move. So there's one, and that was an area where the emergent property was predicted because somebody designed a car and predicted if they put the parts together in this way, that's how they would behave. Another one, life. Life itself is an emergent property. As you may have remembered from your biology class, the components of a cell are not alive, but together they make up a system that is alive. And you can really see this when you look at enzyme action, which is just this abiotic process that just carries out chemical reactions. And yet put the right enzymes in the right order, in the right place, in the right conditions, inside the right membrane, and you'll have a cell that can reproduce itself. And finally, an example that I found online that I liked is the taste of saltiness. You could never know what saltiness is just by tasting sodium and chlorine, which are both toxins, and by themselves do not taste salty. In fact, I highly recommend that you do not try to taste sodium or chlorine ever by themselves. So that is going to do it for our first lecture on properties of systems. Tomorrow, we are going to hear about systems thinking and why it's important to think about systems and how you can teach yourself to do systems thinking.